Thanks for coming. Thanks to AWS Loft for hosting. I'm Robert Dowling. I'm a board member of the Executive Council and CEO of a marketing company called Hudson Cutler. So I want to introduce our guest, Jeremy Johnson. He's the CEO of Andela. I'm going to let him talk a little bit about his background, but we're going to take your questions at the end. So instructions on the monitors about how to submit questions or vote up questions, and we'll get to those sort of in the last section of the event. So Jeremy, you want to give us a little background on you?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Thank you for having me. For a little bit of background and context, serial entrepreneur, spent my life, I guess, in and around startups. Co-founded an ed tech company that we took public in 2014, stepped down 3 months later to co-found Andela. I was initially our CTO of that ed tech company, and like many of you, we struggled to find the right talent, to convince that talent to want to work with us as opposed to really like sexy startup or a large company that could pay significantly more. And ultimately had to make really challenging decisions around how we were going to bring in and manage technical talent because it was one of the limiting factors for our company, for growth. So Andela is born of like this very simple premise. We believe that brilliance is evenly distributed around the world. Opportunity, not so much. How do you identify and cultivate the next generation of technical talent in a way that solves a very material problem for high-growth companies all over the world trying to address this? Because who wouldn't want a top 2% developer working like as a full-time dedicated team member if you could find that person and convince them that this is the thing to work on? But doing that in a way that also allows us to then build the tools and ultimately understand the data behind how do you make distributed teams work. And so a fundamental part of this is the understanding that if you're looking for your top talent in New York, great, so is everyone else. Silicon Valley gets worse. Like, unless one is able to think about distributed, but distributed thoughtfully in a high quality way, but still distributed, then it's really difficult for anyone other than the highest growth, like sexiest startups, or the largest, most profitable companies to afford the kind of people that we need to build great companies. And so that is the specific problem that Andela solves, and it is partially a function of identifying the right talent. There are 64 different assessments, literally, that someone goes through as a developer applying to Andela, but then also breaking down how do you know what the right teammate is going to look like. We break down what it takes to be a distributed developer into a little over 1,000 different like overall technical objectives that we believe comprise the technical as well as team skills or soft skills needed to be a great distributed team member, and ultimately try to use that to reduce the complexity for our partner companies of identifying and then bringing in amazing team members. The good news is that we spend a ton of time on this problem, so feel free to throw your favorite questions around how you go about it. I'm happy to get into the weeds on thinking through the process of both identifying and then nurturing top talent.
Well, we definitely want to learn more about the process of sourcing talent, of training and developing that talent and deploying it. But for context, maybe first, you are a serial entrepreneur, a serial glutton for punishment, and have had self-inflicted wounds are the best kind. You have gone through the process. How much of your experience developing these companies have gone into the thinking behind Andela?
For 2U, my previous company, like one of our challenges throughout was identifying and then cultivating a great engineering team. And we were fortunate to be able to find some extraordinary people, but it was never a simple process. And it was one of the limiting factors on growth and what our product roadmap could look like. Having spent a number of years in that environment, and we were the third fastest B2B SaaS company to get from 0 to 50 million in revenue, ever. It went well.
Wow.
And at the same time, we still struggled, just like the vast majority of other people, to find great talent. As we grew, we started basically becoming more and more experimental in terms of how we would think about trying to find and nurture talent. And that directly contributed to how, when we think about what great distributed teams look like, and when we work at Andela with partner companies to help them think through how to both bring in, but then also manage distributed processes, it's all directly applicable. Because ultimately, most of the stuff is not that complicated. There are a lot of habits that are hard to do consistently, but it's not that complicated ultimately. Building a framework and then doing it well, that takes a lot of work, and it's really nice to learn from other people's mistakes sometimes. And so I would wish that learning from other people's mistakes on all of you.
I'd love to dig into a little bit about the sourcing of talent, but for many young and emerging companies, the prospect of looking for a distributed model versus an FTE, which there's something reassuring about having your development staff in front of you. When they show up, you can kind of poke around and ask them questions about what they're doing. What are the major considerations that a leadership team in a emerging company need to think about when it comes to making that move from, all right, I've got my staff here. I mean, cost is obviously a big issue, and I'd love to know more about the financials. But what are the main considerations there?
Yeah, the first thing I would say is that distributed is not for everyone at all stages. And so if you are your company now, a couple friends tossing around an idea, trying to figure out how might customers react to this, or how might this potentially engage with the world, if there's nothing resembling product market fit or the ability to even move directly towards it, I actually don't know that I'd recommend a distributed team. I would say in that environment, you want to get some level of, we're going to just basically continuously push against each other and our hypotheses to iterate as rapidly as possible. And one of the things that distributed does, it doesn't have to slow down your iteration, done well, but oftentimes in the early days, when every week matters immensely, it's tough to put those processes in place immediately. And so as you start transitioning into, we have a product roadmap, we have users or customers engaging with that product, and now the question becomes, how quickly can we move against that product roadmap? How consistently and effectively can we basically move the ball down the field? All of a sudden, you start thinking about, well, if you were to break engineering tasks into level of complexity, assign points to them, what you really care about is how many points are you delivering on a given, over a given period of time. Mm-hmm. And then you just need the best people possible. And yes, cost is part of the value equation, of course. But ultimately, what you care about is, what does it cost per point, or whatever metric you use, to move your product roadmap forward, and what's the most efficient way to do that? And so quality of your teammate, the caliber of the people you work with, is actually likely to have an even bigger impact than pure cost, but the two of them are both part of the equation. And so ultimately, that's what you begin to optimize for, is that efficiency of your product roadmap. Then the notion of distributed means all of a sudden, it's not just the best person for a role within 20 miles of your office, mm-hmm. or New York, maybe more like 2 or 3, yeah. But instead, who is the best person, period? And that's a very different thing to think through as a founder and as an engineering leader. It's what would the best possible person look like for this? And it's a question I'd rather ask.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. Are there specific technical specifications, kinds of applications or projects that just make more sense for distributed, or you know?
It's less about the technical specifications and more about your ability as an engineering leadership team or your engineering leadership's team, ability to structure and then create clarity around what success looks like. One of the things that people frequently miss, one of the most consistently misunderstood components of distributed, is doing it well actually looks an awful lot like doing in-person management well. It's basically, the way to think about it is, who here has been to a kid's birthday party that was for bowling recently, where you had those bumpers on the sides of the lanes? There's a quick show of hands who's seen one of those in the past decade.
Oh, I've seen.
They exist, I promise. Here's the thing: if you are 5 and trying to figure out how to get the ball down the lane, they're immensely useful. But a professional bowler, it doesn't matter at all. It's not going to touch it. It has no relevance. And so an amazing engineering leader, the exact same thing. Whether you're local or distributed, has almost no relevance, because the way that you're structuring your team, documenting progress, documenting your code, sharing understanding of what success looks like is so similar that you just don't really care. You're able to do it either way. But the less comfortable you are with being really a hands-on, detail-oriented engineering leader, honestly, the nice thing about the water cooler is you can avoid a bunch of accidental screw-ups that come from basically just people not doing those things and then needing to more quickly calibrate when there are mistakes. And so I think of it less like a sort of tech stack thing and more of how comfortable are we with what are fairly well established best practices, but actually doing them consistently. If we're going to make a decision, are we going to document why we made that decision so that other people will understand it? That should happen regardless. Are you doing your 9 a.m. stand-up consistently and keeping track of what people committed to and how they did against it? Are you breaking down the complexity of tickets into more granular and specific definitions so that you can then hand them out to different people and understand what the relative amount of time or difficulty is going to be? These things should all happen. Frequently in the early days, one isn't doing them consistently. That's also one of the benefits of distributors. It forces some of those conversations. But ultimately, the best engineering leaders, they just don't care. They understand exactly what the level of impact of each engineer is in the team. And as a result of that, and being able to quantify the output of that engineer, where they're sitting is kind of irrelevant.
Well, I want to ask you about sourcing talent, right? There's a lot of great talent globally, but it strikes me that we haven't talked about one of the most amazing parts of Andela, which is this mission-driven element. And I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit and how that was an impetus for not just starting the company, but how that's impacted where you found talent.
Yeah, completely. I mean, think about what it takes to be a great engineer. Experience matters, and raw ability matters. And experience can be cultivated over time. You can actually accelerate one's ability to engage and learn. It's hard to accelerate raw talent. Yeah. That's more complicated. And so if you look at the bell curve of humanity and realize race, gender, and nationality have nothing to do with ability. Nothing. The bell curve's identical. Then all of a sudden, you start to think more broadly about what talent means and how you think about building up capacity. And so Andela primarily operates in sub-Saharan Africa. Our first campus was Lagos, Nigeria. Second, Nairobi, Kenya. Third, Kampala, Uganda. And we just announced Kigali, Rwanda as our 4th individual center. And this is in 4.5 years. We're about 1,500 people across the globe. But of those 1,500, roughly 1,400 are across Africa, And so the vast majority of the company is based in parts of the world that the tech world, by and large, doesn't think about right now. Not everyone, but by and large, as part of our talent strategy, which, when you look at the metrics, is kind of insane, actually, and is something that has enabled Andela to, in addition to identifying that raw aptitude and sort of innate ability, to then invest in cultivating that next generation of talent. That now it means you've got developers from across the continent working with over 150 of the top high growth companies in the developed world, but doing that through the lens of they're just core team members. They are engaging and viewed as they're just a part of the team.
Yeah. I mean, I like the underlying ethos of doing well by doing good, and it's clearly a part of the world that has not been on the forefront of development resources, and you've clearly made a difference. Can you talk a little bit about the process of making that happen, not just sourcing talent, but also spinning that talent up and deploying it in a way that makes it not just competitive, but more compelling than many other regions?
I think it's important to remember that you look at our partner companies, and of them, basically none of them started working with Andela because of the mission orientation. It's, there are a couple exceptions, but the vast majority see the world through the lens of I just need great talent. And so I think that's
as a marketer, I say it's a great PR story, though.
Well, potentially. There are some branding challenges also, though, from a marketing standpoint, because you think about a somewhat skeptical sort of head of engineering thinking about, well, I love the idea of this existing, but I'm busy. And in practice, the people that work with us, they think of it as almost a competitive advantage. This is maybe we shouldn't talk about this too much. This is just a great thing to have. And so there's an interesting back and forth about it. For us, in thinking through how we would go about identifying and then cultivating, it's a hardcore focus on where do you have pools of basically drive and raw ability. Do you have to be a genius to be a software developer? No, but it doesn't hurt. And so if you're able to identify and then invest in top 2% aptitude and sort of problem solving developers, you just end up with a very different interaction model in terms of how you can engage with companies. And so most companies that think of themselves as something resembling a tech talent partner, you're not going to, when working with them, you're not going to end up with people who you look at and say God, I wish I could have worked with this person. They're just an awesome team member. It's not a universal truth. There are certainly exceptions, but by and large, top developers are working directly with companies. We're creating a conduit so that these extraordinary developers are able to work with directly with companies, but in the process, also using that as a way to then build the tools and systems needed to do distributed well, which is in and of itself a major impediment for many companies to start with it in the first place.
Now, when you deploy talent, do you tend to deploy in teams, individuals? Is it different per deployment?
So it varies from company to company, but the most common is thinking of it through the lens of a pod. And so what most companies want to do, whether it's a sort of individual Scrum team or a huddle around an individual project or individual product, you're going to want some mix of more experienced and less experienced developers. Probably something everyone here already knows. That being said, part of why it's useful, beyond the fact that there are cost synergies in having that mix, is over time, you want to be thinking about investing in your talent as well. The way that you are able to maintain, a really promising young engineer is them feeling as if they're growing and learning, and feeling as if they're going to then be able to continue doing that with the team, solving problems that are interesting to them. And so through that lens, like you'd like to have in general, let's call it, a senior developer, a couple mid-level developers, and a couple junior developers, generally working together in sync and able to think through like how should work be most effectively distributed based on level of experience and level of complexity, but where everyone is learning as a result of it. So you essentially amplify the impact of that senior developer. We generally recommend a structure like that. It doesn't mean that there aren't a bunch of other examples. We have Series C high growth startup just raised a $40 million round from Excel that has Andela engineers. Like when they hire a new local engineer, they pair them with an Andela engineer. So they're doing nearly full-time pair programming because they recognize that it would just amplify the sort of impact to be able to just, again, from a value standpoint, get more productivity out of the existing sort of infrastructure.
Yeah.
So there are a couple different iterations on it, but ultimately pods or something that resembles like high-end staff augmentation is the most common and generally what we'd recommend in terms of thinking about distributed.
Yeah. So some of these engagements can get extensive, and which means those pods are integral to the development of your customer's business. How do you tackle the challenge of longevity, of retention, and work that out with your clients that may want to hire these guys, and look at not just okay, we're working project to project, but really strategic technical resources for customers?
Yeah. So we've gone through this interesting sort of like there is this interesting inflection curve that happens with partners when they start working with us, where over time, like people will start thinking like, I want to do this, and then they dig into, actually, this is one of the challenges of distributed. It's a pain in the ass to have people in lots of countries all over the world, just structurally, like the logistics of it are just actually pretty intense. And you start looking at what are alternatives. Some people will do contractors. You can only do it for a certain period of time. Like what ends up happening usually like 6 to 12 months in is someone saying, actually, we kind of like that you take care of all the HR stuff and all of the like overhead, and we get to just focus on like basically building our product. And so it kind of comes back around to it. And so we take no issue with it. Like it could go in either direction. And I'd say, the larger the company, the more often that the conversation comes up. But ultimately, I believe what we're going to see from a future of like, where is the future of work and how is it evolving, is that there will be essentially companies that enable sort of scaling of talent as a service, basically, so that you're able to work with people that you'd love to work with that feel and are embedded as full-time team members, but don't all have to be FTEs. It's sort of a continuation of what currently exists already with a PEO kind of relationship, but more extensive. Like what if you added real estate? What if you added benefits? What if you added like hardware? The things that you would think are generally like provided by a handful of different organizations. I think you're going to see more and more of that because it just enables, especially for high growth companies, to focus on their core competency as opposed to this sort of smorgasbord of other things that most companies as they scale end up having to figure out how they do well on their own, but are kind of a pain in the ass.
Yeah. In all the deployments you've done so far, what's been the biggest challenge or the unexpected speed bump, and how have you dealt with it?
The biggest challenges in like distributed in general are generally there are two areas that become really like problematic for many companies, and we've had to address both of them in like very specific ways. But they're also part of what makes Africa so obvious, like in hindsight. One of them is language, and so if you are scaling with, a development team in Latin America or Eastern Europe, like language is a real challenge. You might be able to find a handful of developers that speak English well enough to engage, but like scaling that becomes harder. Not impossible, but it's a significant challenge. And the other is Timezone. And so there, you benefit with Latin America or Canada, but you struggle when talking about like Southeast Asia, for instance. Like it's really difficult if, in order to make a system function, someone has to consistently like get up really early or stay up really late to be able to work in real time. And so if you want to do distributed well, you need to be able to communicate. And you need to be able to communicate in real time frequently. And so one of the, like really you combine those together and you get this benefit of like where we operate. Like West Africa is 5 or 6 hours from the East Coast, depending on the time of year. Shift a few hours, all of a sudden you can overlap for most of the day. So we overlap for at least half the day. You want the morning, by the way, if at all possible. And so ideally, you've got your 9 a.m. stand-up, and then have a couple hours to unpack things after that. And you end up with a really effective communication pattern. And, by the way, you've got large English-speaking populations. And so you look at it, and in retrospect, it becomes kind of obvious, and yet the world doesn't think of it that way.
And what about the opposite? Something that has worked out really well, or maybe you've delivered for clients that wasn't necessarily in the business plan, but is an unexpected benefit?
The very first engagement we ever had, a developer in our first cohort in Lagos, Nigeria. His name is Shayun Martins. Shayun is like as nice as humans come and like fairly understated. So like he would not tell you the story this way, but the CTO at his first partner company absolutely would. We started working with them, and I'd known Shayun for about 6 months. This is sort of an experiment to see if like this sort of structure and model could work. Like a team member operating like independently, but as like a distributed like fashion in real time. This was 6 weeks into the partnership. Bob, their CTO, calls me and says, "Jeremy, like Shayun 6 weeks in just fixed a bug that's been slowing down user signups for the past 6 months and a complete pain in the ass. Are there more people like him? Mm-hmm. Like he's amazing." And those kind of reactions are both, in some ways, like a little bit sad of what like the tech world's like understanding of the continent is, and also like really inspiring in terms of like someone being able to realize, oh, like I wasn't sure what to expect from this, and what I should expect is excellence. Mm-hmm. Like what I should expect is like this is a great experience, and this is a great team member, and I'm so glad this person is helping me solve my problems. And it's the kind of thing where it doesn't fit the traditional like narrative and structure, and so I think is oftentimes harder for people to like internalize. But you see it over and over and over again of just like worlds colliding and then meshing and then realizing that we're all just people. All of a sudden, you start to believe that can actually happen regularly, which is dangerous. But wouldn't it be nice?
Yeah. Well, I'm sure as a CEO, you get very few calls saying, "What a wonderful job. Thanks for all of your help."
Tragically, no. It's the weirdest thing.
CEO is the complaints department. I mean, it's just that's the role. So a call like that is really terrific. I'm going to go to the top question here because I was like, I was watching as it went to 6 thumbs. I'm like, all right, I'm gonna ask that. So this is a little sort of a new division of Andela, or maybe your next startup. Are there startup roles besides engineers that you would think are a good fit for distributed remote teams, and which do you think are not?
Yeah, there absolutely are. The general principle around it is, can you quantify the output of this thing? It doesn't mean it has to be the same thing over and over. It doesn't mean it has to be simple, but you do have to be willing to try to directionally quantify it. And so if you are able to do that, all of a sudden, things like data science become pretty obvious. We do a bunch of DevOps and AWS work now, because it's not pure software development, but there are a lot of components to it that require software development knowledge and sort of experience for how well-functioning teams are run. And so if you can quantify basically what good looks like and be able to evaluate whether or not like directionally someone is doing better or worse as a result of those numbers, then you're likely able to do it in a distributed fashion at scale. The more you can quantify it, the earlier you can do it in a distributed way. If it's sort of opaque, like at scale, you're probably getting enough data from 100 people all doing it that it's easier than if there are 3. But if there are 3 and it's really clear in how you quantify it, you might be just fine. And so the bigger you get, the more the data becomes usable, the more you can quantify, and the more distributed becomes fairly obvious. And that is the direct connection. One other difference, there are some things like design, for instance, where someone might have extraordinarily specific, like culturally driven preferences that are not good or bad, but add complexity to it. So it doesn't mean you can't do things like that in a distributed way, but you have to be willing to go back and forth really frequently for the first few months to make sure that you're aligning on like what is structurally good, or not that many startups have this early on, but have a really well-defined like brand book, for instance. So if you've worked with, a great branding agency and have like a ton of structure around it, you can probably do that a bit sooner. But there are things like that where you just have additional complexity born of like human preference that makes it even harder to quantify.
One of the people I work with at Hudson Cutler came to me one day with this really great guide she put together on how to manage an agency. And I thought, wow, this is about 50 years overdue. What counsel do you have for your customers in terms of how to manage Andela and your teams? What are the major considerations, and then what are the tricks of the trade?
Yeah, we spend a lot of time on it, including like coming in and doing presentations on how to do distributed well. We start with an Andela developer, and the Andela experience should fit into your like development ecosystem, like as much as possible. Like an Andela developer is going to use they're in your Slack instance, like they're in your GitHub repository, like it's a fully integrated, embedded like experience. That being said, a lot of people are like, great, but we think what we're doing is probably kind of mediocre. And so could you tell us what we should be doing in terms of how it works? And so it's not, again, you can't be good at everything. We do a bunch of, it's not like this is the Andela guidebook, although in fairness, we probably should put that together because it like exists internally. We just end up sort of explaining it over and over. But it's more of a set of like initial recommendations followed by, and so what are the challenges you're having? Like, all right, let's talk about how you can address those specifically to make this the most effective experience possible. Mm-hmm. And frequently that is how to do distributed well, how to make sure that one is following sort of, these best practices.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you have a successful engagement that you could sort of walk us through the process of how they came to you, what the challenge was, what your response was, how you put that team together, and then what kind of results you drove?
One that we were talking about earlier is a company called Envision. Who knows Envision here? All right. So awesome company. If you don't know about them, you totally should. They help you make software more effectively. And they are one of the fastest growing startups in the country, but are also very familiar with distributed. It's an almost entirely distributed team from the beginning. They have Andela developers across, I think, 6 different teams now. And so it's the model where you have individual Scrum teams focused on very specific areas of the business. And you've got Andela developers essentially augmenting, a team of 4 to 5 developers, so 6, 7 total, working in tandem to basically move faster through the product roadmap for that team. One of the fun things also is that as part of the process, we actually get to bring developers on site with partner companies, both at the beginning and then annually. Like we basically subsidize the cost of the trip. Another sort of distributed thing I would think about if I were trying to imagine what distributed might look like for like a company at the early days, even if you're doing everything remote, you want to have some face time. And the reason is actually because what it allows you to do is build trust faster. And so like trust and like rapport is actually a pretty important variable in the effectiveness of a team. Like how well do you know the people around you? It may sound counterintuitive to some, but I promise you this happens. It's not that you can't build really close relationships online. You totally can. It just takes longer. And so if you want to accelerate that process, it is well worth the time to spend at least, like think of it as once a year, some time all coming together in person. You end up with just significantly more productivity as a result of having those sort of shared bonds and relationships that come from it.
In terms of where startups are in their development life cycle, what's your sweet spot?
I would look at us sort of in the middle there. Like if you are trying to get an MVP out as quickly as possible, probably not the right solution. If you are trying to figure out what is the product going to be, again, probably not the right solution. Like I would try to keep that as rapid and basically close to the like rapid feedback of people just bouncing ideas back and forth, where they can read each other's body language as possible. As you transition into, like if you average Series A, you're at a, roughly, 1 million recurring revenue, like run rate. If you're at that point, and there are different metrics for consumer companies, but in general, you're at a point where like there is enough traction where you're trying to get somewhere. At that point, like Andela and distributed in general become like something that is extremely like compelling as a value proposition. But I would say before that, more questionable. And the irony is that like a bunch of large companies like could and should be trying to do something like this. Mm-hmm. And their structures just make it difficult for them. And so it's way harder to be a developer at Envision than United Healthcare. No offense to United Healthcare if anyone here is working with them. I'm sure they're wonderful people. But it's not where developers want to be in general. Like the places where you're going to find great developers are like high growth, like interesting companies. And we've ended up working mostly with them because they're also the ones that, because they're growing quickly, have the highest need and therefore are willing to try something that sounds crazy until a couple of their friends are like, actually, no, this is kind of awesome. Like, this is a good thing. Yeah. And so you end up in a harder, like more challenging environment, but at the same time, you know what? It's more fun, so it's okay.
We're going to take another from the field. What makes a good developer, and how do you assess that?
So the technical side is actually fairly obvious, and there are a dozen different services to sort of like quantify existing technical abilities. The harder thing to understand is actually the soft skills side. And this is, I would argue, important for all developers, but in particular important for distributed team members, because you have to be able to communicate effectively. You can't accidentally kind of like back into it. Like you have to communicate. You have to think about how will you be like received and what are you trying to project, what are you trying to get across, then verify that someone understood what you were trying to get across. And so when we think about not just talent identification, but also how do you like talent verification and cultivation, we spend a lot of time talking about like what does it mean to integrate well into your partner team, like the company that you're working with. What does it mean to be able to communicate well? What does stakeholder management in a high growth company mean for distributed developers? There are specific skills involved in this. And it could be as simple as like, show me the like 23-year-old that's a year out of MIT that will have this conversation. They're sitting there trying to get something done. They've got a full load, like they've got 3 different tickets that they're thinking about and like trying to focus on one. And someone comes in and says, like, engineering manager says, hey, this thing just broke. Like, I need you to get on this today. And they will turn around and say, okay, I can do that. Which of these 3 things do you want me to hold off on until next week? That's it. Super simple. The general response is, sure, I'll figure it out, and not say, all right, so how am I prioritizing it relative to everything else? And those are the kind of things that, if you've been in the working world for a few years, become obvious. Like, we learn through, like, basically knocking our heads against a wall and having a mentor and the managers that show us, like, school doesn't teach this. People don't know it by default. If you're going to be a great distributed team member, you have to basically break down what are those things. Like, what are the soft skills that go into being able to engage at a level that doesn't sound all that complicated, but for someone who doesn't have a ton of work experience, actually might be, and is one of the challenges that distributed teams get themselves into, is you've got someone that seems like they've got really strong technical skills. This is going to be great. What could possibly go wrong? And then they don't realize that they should give you a heads up when they, like, want feedback on some code that they're, the code that they're committing. Like, there are things that seem obvious that aren't. And in distributed environments, you have to both better define what should be obvious, but also you need to expect and work towards, like, soft skills as a significant part of it. So we think of that, like, EQ, IQ thing as being, like, fundamentally interlinked and part of what, like, makes for a great developer, period, but a necessity for great distributed team members.
Yeah, I mean, you've got to both rely on your clients to manage your resources, but you have to still manage your resource and also connect the dots with clients. So you triangulate on that process.
Totally. We're also getting, so we've built a developer framework around what we look at as, like, this is high quality, like, output for developers. So broken down into a combination of technical skills as well as team skills, which is what we refer to as soft skills. And we ask feedback roughly every week, and it's just -2 to 2. Like, it's super simple, but on each of these individual, like, areas to say, like, how is the developer doing, so that we can essentially provide, like, management oversight and guidance. And so if something is really good, we want to know, like, what was it? And if something's really bad, we want to know what was it, so that we can then do something about it, actually, in both cases. Hard skills are wildly important, but at the same time, like, 18 months ago, like, if you were building, like, something in, like, modern front-end language, you were using Angular. And today, no one cares about Angular. Everyone's moved to React. Like, you have a pretty quick, like, sort of life cycle. And as that continues, like, how many folks here have seen people looking for, like, job descriptions with, like, I need someone with 5 years of Swift experience. Like, Swift didn't exist 5 years ago. And so it's not to say that it's not important. We care a lot more about how quickly someone can learn and how well they understand, like, the framework of what they're looking to build than we do about specific expertise in a certain individual tech stack. Does that make sense? So it's not to, like, say that, like, deep technical knowledge isn't incredibly important. It is. But what we are looking to measure is, like, how well is this person going to, as the sort of, like, the world continues to evolve, like, how well are they going to adapt to that? And, like, ultimately, like, we think that's what leadership is going to be, is, like, how much can you, like, adapt and understand, like, the foundations in order to consistently stay ahead of the curve, and at the same time be able to engage with people in teams to build things.
There was a question up here that was interesting about how you've got co-founders and other leaders on the team, what your approach to hiring is, and not just internally for your team, but as you scale this, what do you look for, and what's your approach, and how do you manage it?
So at the very beginning, there were 6 of us, and you've got 2 from the US, 1 from Canada, 1 from Cameroon, and 2 from Nigeria. And so it's sort of like the definition. Only 1 out of 6 was female, but other than that, like, the definition of, like, this, like, incredibly diverse cast of characters coming together to try to solve this problem that, quite frankly, it was bigger than any of us individually. We think of hiring through a fairly similar lens. I don't want to get too off topic, but something that is, I think people frequently misunderstand is around diversity. And, like, this is a huge issue in tech, and it's an issue for a variety of reasons, but one of them is that, like, if you want to see the world clearly, you need people with different perspectives.
Yeah.
Like, it just period. Like, you have a better ability to understand reality if people that look at the world differently and have had different lived experiences come together to try to define it and figure out the path forward. And so we take that approach in terms of like our hiring. We had a leadership offsite that was month and a half ago. So it's basically like directors and above from around the world, everyone from every country. And you looked at the numbers, and it was actually like of the 42 people there, like 21 were from the like U.S., which is mostly senior people that you wouldn't be able to hire in one of the locations, and 21 from the continent. Like, it was like literally exactly like parallel. Yeah. That was not intentional, but it was pretty cool. Yeah, and it definitely does speak to like a broader feeling for us that like if you want to solve really complicated global problems, you need to take a fairly broad sort of macro approach to thinking through like how those problems came to be and how you then address it. Yeah. And Andela certainly wouldn't be possible if it weren't for that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you do have cultural, language, other challenges to overcome. Do you have processes in place? Do you account for that in hiring? How do you deal with those?
Yeah, there are a ton of. We could have a whole other conversation about it. But yes, early on we had HR, which we call people, just structured in each country, and you realize, like, wait a second, like, we have different promotion processes in different countries and different things that, quite frankly, like, need to be systematized. And so as we grew, we then realized, all right, we need to be really thoughtful about what is central versus what is like individual. And so we celebrate the like individual differences and uniqueness of, like, you know, Kenya and Nigeria are very different countries. Like, immensely different. And that is something we want to celebrate and think of as part of the strength, but we need one set of HR policies. Yeah. And so you need to be able to kind of think through and balance that. And I think of that as one of the reasons you need a diverse set of perspectives to come together, because, like, do I know what the right answer is there? No, absolutely not. And at the same time, as a team, you've got a group of people that really can bounce things off of each other in a like straightforward, like frank, clear way that allows you to actually come up with something that's pretty good. And is it going to be perfect? Probably not. But you're going to get above Amazon's 70% threshold, and you're going to learn as you go from that. And you know, you get to continue building, and that's what we're excited about doing.
Awesome. All right, we've got one from the field.
Companies that engage Andela, you have multiple employees from Andela. Is it typical that they're all in one site, or would there be multiple sites? And assuming that there are multiple people in one site, do they typically sit together? So at least they still have that kind of internal remote feel going.
Yeah. So this is actually a fun internal debate for us right now. We do this frequently because partners will ask for it. They'll say, you know what, I want to have essentially like, you know, name your company East. And this is like our like individual office. And what we found looking at the data is that it actually doesn't seem to impact quality. And so it sounds crazy. What we've seen is that overall quality of output has been consistent, whether or not that team has been in one location or separate across multiple. That doesn't mean that it's not the commonly held perception that this should be the case. And quite frankly, if one isn't thinking about distributed best practices and like how to do that well, it probably becomes even more of a truism that like actually, yes, just like keep everyone together. And so we do it on request. But what it usually ends up doing is slowing down the process of then being able to like make sure that we can like get the right resources into the right team at the right time. And so there's a little bit of a trade-off there. We're okay either way, but it's usually driven by our clients, which we call partners, because we think of it as like a long-term talent partnership, but driven more by partners than by like our choice. If people are in the same country, we have them sit together. Because why not? But it does not seem to be deeply important or really, from a data standpoint, at all important in terms of the productivity of that partnership, which I was fascinated by the way. Like, I was surprised by this. saw this for the first time like 6 months ago. We had like enough data to actually show it. I was like, huh, I didn't see that one coming.
What team role is most important in bridging the gap between distributed team members and the company itself?
It's actually a little bit like you need a great DevOps person. You want to have an engineering leader that's going to give real feedback and not be afraid of it. Like there are a bunch of things that are like relevant roles that the structure of the role becomes even more important in a distributed environment. But I actually think that the thing that's going to have the biggest impact is less about like one individual role, and instead whether or not the people that are in one location that are centrally located treat the distributed team as if they're full team members. And the reason is, imagine like being on Zoom meetings all the time where like you've got 3 people in a room and 2 people are somewhere not in that room, and the 3 people in the room are like consistently focused on, and this happens just naturally, the other people in the room. Like that's where your attention goes. And so it makes it hard for the distributed person to then speak up or engage in a meaningful way. And so the pure like best practice would be in a distributed environment, if anyone is distributed, everyone goes into their own individual Zoom room. And by the way, like you can actually see whether people are paying attention there in a way that you can't if there are like 7 of us sitting around a table. And so I actually think you probably end up with more engaged meetings, but that's, we're getting a little bit off topic. But even if, for instance, you're going to have 3 people there, like at the worst case, if someone in the like online wants to speak, they should have the right of way. And by that I mean like if they start saying something, people in the room should defer to let them go first so that you encourage them to engage more. And so it's like simple, small things that by treating your distributed team like just members of the team in general, you end up with a very different dynamic for how a team will engage and what their therefore like productivity is going to be. And so that like mental model of distributed is just a team member. It's not, sort of nameless and faceless certainly, but it's just a member of our team, has a bigger impact than any individual role in terms of managing it, because that mentality then permeates how the entire team interacts, which therefore becomes your culture, and your culture becomes your destiny. And so like that is going to be the biggest like mental shift when thinking about like, can we make this work really, really well?
So thanks to you guys for showing up and listening. Thanks to AWS Loft, and Jeremy, thank you so much for the insight.